This video is sponsored by Crippled God Foundry. So guys, for some strange reason, me, Josh from the Pickle Jar and Dave from MS Paints, we've all decided to do some Wars of Stars dioramas for some strange reason. Something must be in the water. So don't forget to go check out their videos after this. But I'm really looking forward to this because we're going to try and add a little bit of realism to a fantasy sci-fi film. I'll catch you after this.
Now, the scene that I'm wanting to create from Star Wars is the AT-ST getting hit by the Ewok traps, and I thought the best way to show this will be in a little vignette, so like a 3D sort of picture frame. How I'm going about this is I've just picked up a frame from the range and I'm just opening that up, and what I'm going to do is build a box onto the back just using a bit of foam board at a depth that's going to suit the models and hide a few Ewoks and big giant redwoods in there. And once it's all sort of dry fitted and laid out, I just simply hot glue this together. Because this is going on my desk, I'm not really bothered about the box itself, because it's either going to be going on a shelf where you're not going to be seeing the background of the box. Now the landform, it's just built up with some more foam board, and I'm just cutting space so the AT-ST with its base can fit in roughly where I want it. And once I've done that, I just sort of dry fit the trees again to sort of get a good idea of how it's going to look. And once I've done this, I need to start making the trees. What I'm doing for these really iconic giant redwoods is I'm using some thick balsa dowels. And the reason I've chose balsa is it's really easy to work with. Just with a couple of sculpting tools, you can easily ingrain a deep grain in there just with a small amount of pressure. And once you've done all that and you've got the deep grain in, to sort of make it look less man-made, what you need to do is get a wire brush and then push that over the top of it. And what this does is get all the little finer details into there. And just be rough with this, don't overly think it, just drag it away until you've got a really nice rough tree texture. After that, we need some big roots, so I'm going to be using some milliput for this. I'd advise putting some greaseproof paper down or silicone paper, because these did stick to my cutting mat. It's not the same as green stuff. It's a lot more sticky. But once you've got the shape, it's just as a matter of copying what you did to the tree and just sculpting and engraving some tree details onto the roots. And then smoothing it out with your finger with a bit of water just to help blend it in so it doesn't look much different to the actual tree itself. Now for the branch work, I'm going to be using a bit of garden wire, and the way I make these really quick and easy is by just using a drill and holding the other end with some pliers and then letting the drill spin. This creates a nice taut branch, and it also, where it bends and when it gets tight, it gives like nice kinks to the branch. And then we just cut them and trim them to the size that we want. And for texture, what I'm using is the fast dry basing glue from my range, and the reason I use this is it's an acrylic based glue and it's a hell of a lot more flexible than PVA glue, and it doesn't shrink or crack over time like PVA glue does. And what I add to that is just some black sand from my range, because it's an ultra fine sand ranging from 0.01 to 0.02 of a mil. And that gives a very nice sort of tree bark look to it once it's spread out on there and dried. Now I super glue the trees in place, making sure that they're going to all fit with the roots on. If not, I trim the roots to fit, but luckily they all went in there. Not as hard as I originally planned, but they all fit in a place where the AT-ST and everything could still fit. And it actually looked a lot more fuller this way, and I did like the look. Now with moving studios and everything, I didn't have any modelling compounds at hand, so I used a bit of air drying clay to build up the landform. It's not ideal this, because it takes a long time to dry and it can crack with the thickness that I'm using it, but for the small diorama it was just easy to throw it on there. And we build up the landform with that and smooth it out and make sure that the base and everything's going to fit. And once I've got that landform worked out, I just copy the roots from the trees into the clay, so it looks like it's continuing on and they're not just sat on top of it. Now, one great thing with balsa, it's really soft, and if you don't have any tools, you can just use a bradawl or a pin or even just a nail to make holes to put your branches in. However, because I'd super glued them in place because I'm working in such a small box, I did decide to Dremel some of the more thicker branches in place. While I'm heading to work, let me tell you about this week's sponsor, Crippled God Foundry. Crippled God Foundry offer STL files that you can print at home easily. All the files are pre-supported with easy to remove supports, so it's just as simple as slapping them on your build plate and they're done. This monthly theme includes the Death Colosseum, which has loads of themed gladiator type models from good guys to bad guys to big evil horrible monsters. And if that's not enough, there's also a massive Colosseum for you to print in FDM or resin, and it's not just that, there's all the terrain accessories also. It even includes modular spectators, modular gladiators, so you can customize this and make this however you want. And you can get all this massive package for just $10 a month, which is an amazing price. All the links to how you can subscribe to their monthly thematic bundles and detailed miniatures, terrain pieces of high value at such a low subscription price will all be in the links below. I'd like to thank Crippled God Foundry for sponsoring this video and also sponsoring me over the last few years. I love their products and I'm sure you will too. Now back to the video. Now with this being diorama, I can get a lot more realistic with the tree foliage. And the way that I'm doing this is I'm using seafoam as always, but I'm spraying this with varnish and using 2mm static grass over a flop box. You can do this at home with a little desk one, however I'm at work using it over as big one that we use for making tufts. And what this does is the 2mm static grass actually forms around the seafoam and gives you an awesome pine needle look. And you just can't replicate this with any sort of foam or anything. It's the best way to make pine needle foliage. Once I've figured out a way of making this really robust, I'll be using it in my wargaming builds as well, because it looks so goddamn realistic and I absolutely love this foliage. And it sticks in place great just with a bit of super glue. You could use contact adhesive, however, just on this small diorama, using super glue is easy enough because there's plenty of trees close together to balance it all on everything else. Now we're only simulating the bottom part of the tree canopy, so we don't have to do much of this, but it is nice to fill it all out and hide the tops from the frame. And all I'm doing with this is just building like a convincing start of a canopy with the tree foliage. I don't think this look can be replicated any other way. It's just the best way to do pine needle foliage. It looks so convincing. Now for the trap, all I'm using is smaller balsa wood, and all I do is I trim that with a knife to make it quite rough edged, and then we use a bit of garden twine so it looks like vines, and super glue that in place, wrap it round and just apply super glue. Once I've got the loops and everything over the trees, I then dribble super glue down it just so it firms up, and I hold it in place tightly so it looks like the logs themselves are actually quite heavy, because balsa's very light, the string was actually pulling it up and it's looking very slack, so I'll just hold them in place while the super glue dries so it looks like the log's heavy. And on the opposite side, I have to do the same thing, but I'm super gluing the log to the actual picture frame itself, and then just putting one piece of twine around that to hold it in place, and that's all it needs. Best thing about dioramas, you can actually cheat it in areas. Now we've got the trees, the canopy and the traps in place, we need to work on the jungle floor. Now to make this look convincing, I'm using a mixture of natural and fake plants. The reason that I do this is the fake cheap plastic plants have a completely different texture and they have smaller leaves. Now it's hard to find plants that look good straight out the box, so what I do is I trim them up, I cut them down, and I try and look at the plastic plants and find the bits that look pretty nice and to scale. And once I've got them, I then clip them off and go, well, that'll look like a bit of a grass tuft. Don't try and buy the plants on what they actually look like in whole. Treat them as different leaves and different textures and cut them up and use them like that. And then once you've got them in place with a bit of super glue or pinning, however you're going to do that, add in natural things like mosses and sea foam and things like that in there. It's another texture, it's a lot more finer, and even though this is not painted, it already starts to look quite nice. When we start to paint this though is when it really starts to come together. Now we prime it all black and give it a nice zenithal highlight so we can see what we're working with. I'm all the models at the same time while we're doing that step. Now I'm going to be using a completely different paint range for these. I've never tried them before, but the reason that I'm using them is these are the ArchiveX paints that are actually colour matched to Star Wars props. So for painting things like the ATST, I can get the actual colours that I've used from the film. With it being a sci-fi set of paints, there is a hell of a lot of greys, so choosing the right ones was quite complicated. However, on the website there is a name of the paint telling you what vehicle they're for. So once I'd checked out what that was, I then went away to paint the ATST. Now for painting the ATST, I just used some simple stippling and dry brushing techniques, and I was actually really shocked at how the model looked when it was finished. The colours are very, very, very good, and I know you can mix whatever paint you want, but if you're doing a lot of Star Wars, these paints are really good for you, especially if you're scale modelling, because they're absolutely massive. The main reason I liked these paints though is because they're all very muted, and the amount that you get. So for me, they make very nice terrain paints. So I use the ArchiveX paints to paint a good 95% of this entire diorama. So through the airbrush absolutely lovely, and with them being very muted, it means I can get a very nice realistic look to my diorama, which is very much how I like to paint. You know that all my products from my own range are all very natural colours and natural materials. So when I paint things, I attack the diorama with that sort of colour palette, and everything's very desaturated and very muted in colour. And these paints, absolutely perfect for it. And I'm really looking forward to using them more as I go along with my terrain building, just because of the volume of paint you get and how easy it is just to airbrush them on, and you get such a nice look for very little effort. And that's very much how I like to build things. Now the reason that I'm spraying all the foliage and all the static grass and everything is I want it all to be a very similar colour palette, and I'm painting every different plant a slightly different green. So the pine needles, they're going to be like a nice bluey greeny grey. The leafy plastic plants are going to have a bit of yellow and reds put in there, and then the actual realistic moss, that's going to be painted with olive and yellow colours. And doing it all like that, everything looks natural and everything looks as if it's supposed to be there, and even them cheap plastic plants start to look pretty realistic, and they do come up rather well. I don't like the look of the cheap plastic plants if you use them as is, but if you cut them up and put 2 or 3 different ones together, it's surprising how well they'll look all together because you've mixed them in with natural materials as well. And then after I've done all that, we're just left with just putting a bit of a black wash on all the bark of the trees just to accentuate that carving that we did earlier, and a final dry brush just over bits of the wood, and painting the vines a slightly brighter colour just so it doesn't look all too similar. So you've got a couple of parts that do pop a little bit, and we're done. Now I'm going to make a slight modification to one of the Ewoks by cutting his spear out of his hand, just because I want to make him look like he's holding the vine as if he's actually cutting it like he does in the film. And then we'll just place the rest of the Ewoks around the diorama just to add a bit of colour. And it's surprising what just a couple of little models make a difference to the overall diorama. Now the last thing we've got to do is the ground covering, and fitting the ATST in and just super gluing that down in place with the gap that we've left for it. To hide that base, it couldn't be any simpler. All we're doing is using the fast dry basing glue from my range, and then we're using pine forest ground cover. I don't do anything else to this. All I do is put the glue down, sprinkle this all over. Any hard to reach areas, I just use a spoon just to get in between the legs. I dust it off any areas where there is no glue. Give it a good spray of matte Scenics sealant, and then once that's all dried and set, it looks absolutely amazing. It's like the best ground cover for this sort of environment. And the fact that I don't have to paint this just shows how the muted colours and everything that I've used on the fake plants and the natural plants and the whole environment just shows how natural the paint job and everything else is. I absolutely love these ground covers, and I know they're mine and I know they're from my range, and if you like them, let me know below. But all the links to all the products I've used are below. Now, what we're left to do is just building the box back in, but while I was building this, I was like, it's rather dark in there. So I bought an LED strip. Now, the problem with this LED strip is, as you can see, it's very blue. It's very white light. So what I do is I trim it to size, and then what we decide to do is hit it with some transparent paints from Pro Acryl. And what we want to do is sort of simulate the sun. So we hit it with a yellow and an orange, but we're not very consistent with this. We just sort of spray it in areas so it's very irregular as the colour. And it takes the strength of the light down a little bit, and it also just adds that natural warm light to the whole scene. And I think it finishes it off lovely. Now, I absolutely love this diorama for multiple reasons. For me, it's quite a nostalgic thing of watching this with my dad as a kid, and I just love ATSTs and ewoks, and being all natural and doing trees and doing things that I wouldn't normally do on gaming tables, but doing in a diorama thing and trying to make things as realistic as possible is what I enjoy doing. And I absolutely love this. And the fact that it's now a little desk piece that I can sit on my desk and have as a little memory, I absolutely love it. If you like this video, guys, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And if you want to support the channel, don't forget to check out all my products and all the products used in this video below. Thanks for watching, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you again for the next video. Love, love, love.